This is the story of George Stinney. He was just 14 years old when he was taken by the authorities and charged with a crime. They said that he had killed 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 8-year-old Mary Emma Thames.
He did not do this. He did not do this.
Supporters of George Stinney Jr. are celebrating the little things. The fact that after 70 years, a judge ruled the 14-year-old did not get a fair trial.
In 1944, George Stinney Jr. was just 14 when a rush to judgment sent him to his death in South Carolina's electric chair.
At just 14 years old, George Stinney Jr. became the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century, convicted in just one day by an all-white jury with no physical evidence. His trial lasted 2 hours. The jury deliberated for 10 minutes. For decades, his story was buried until recently, when it reemerged as a haunting reminder of racial injustice and systemic failure. It was March 1944 in Alcolu, South Carolina. Two young white girls, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, went missing and were later found brutally murdered in a ditch. George and his younger sister had briefly spoken to them earlier that day. That was enough for police. Within hours, George was arrested. He was interrogated alone without a lawyer and allegedly confessed. There were no witnesses, no physical evidence. And yet, 31 days later, George was tried in a courtroom surrounded by white faces, jury, judge, and prosecutor alike. His court-appointed lawyer presented no defense. Within minutes, the jury returned a guilty verdict. George was sentenced to death by electric chair.
The trial lasted only 2 hours, and the jury had a 10-minute deliberation. George was convicted of murder and sentenced to death.
George waited behind bars as appeals for clemency came pouring in, from the NAACP to churches across the country. His family, forced to flee Alcolu out of fear of a lynch mob, could only watch from afar. George wrote to his siblings, insisting he was innocent. Campaigners tried everything, pointing out that a white boy convicted of a similar crime had received only 20 years. But in South Carolina, justice wasn't colorblind. His final days passed quietly, and no higher court came to his aid. The date was set, June 16, 1944. Just 83 days after his arrest. George's mother was granted one last visit. He cried, telling her he was scared and hadn't done it. The world outside moved on, but inside the prison, a boy was preparing to die. Strapped into a chair far too big for his small frame, George sat atop a Bible used as a booster. The adult-sized mask slipped from his face, exposing his tear-filled eyes. The first jolt didn't kill him. It took 2 more. Outside the chamber, his family waited in silence, never allowed to witness his execution. For decades, no grave marker stood. The state of South Carolina, however, marked the case as closed.
Since he was so young, they couldn't strap him in right. They took the Bible he was carrying and made him use it as a booster seat.
For decades, the case lay buried, but whispers grew louder. Historians uncovered potential deathbed confessions from other suspects. High school students, attorneys, and activists revived the case. In 2014, a judge finally vacated George's conviction, citing a failure of due process. Not proof of innocence, just proof that the system failed him. Yet the victims' families held firm. To them, George was guilty. The pain remained on both sides. Those who saw the execution would never forget it. Some remembered the oversized mask falling, others the tear down his cheek. A former journalist called it the most chilling miscarriage of justice he'd ever encountered. As the electricity surged through the body of a child, so too did the realization this wasn't just a crime. It was a national wound.
Judgment, they pointed out in a crime like this, there would have been a great deal of blood, and yet they found no blood anywhere on their brother's clothing. Don?
George Stinney Jr. was executed not because of what he did, but because of who he was and where he lived. His story is not just about race or justice, it is about a country still struggling to define those very words. The name George Stinney now lives not in shame, but in warning. A name carved into history not by what was proven, but by what was denied. The truth, the defense, and above all, his childhood. Charles Rumbaugh was only 17 when he was sentenced to die. A troubled teen with a violent past, he became the first juvenile executed in the United States since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. His case raised haunting questions. Can a child shaped by abuse and mental illness ever be held fully accountable? And did America fail one of its most broken sons? Charles Rumbaugh had a history of violent crime even before this incident. Just days earlier, he robbed a motel in San Angelo. On April 4th, 1975, Charles Rumbaugh walked into a jewelry store in Amarillo, Texas. What started as a robbery escalated into a deadly encounter. Michael Fiorillo, a 58-year-old store owner, was shot and killed. It wasn't Rumbaugh's first run-in with violence. He had robbed motels and carried weapons from a young age. But this act sealed his fate. The court saw not a boy, but a dangerous man. He was tried as an adult and sentenced to death at just 17. It marked one of the first death sentences for a juvenile in modern American history. Charles Rumbaugh was sentenced to death and executed for the murder of 58-year-old Michael Fiorillo during a jewelry store robbery. Behind bars, Rumbaugh's behavior became even more erratic. He attempted suicide twice, once with a razor blade, once by overdose. He escaped jail with 2 others by tying bed sheets together, and in court, he lunged at a U.S. Marshal, begging to be shot. Diagnosed with schizophrenia and severe paranoia, Rumbaugh refused further appeals. He didn't seek mercy. He embraced death. It was as if the system had broken him long before the state ever did. On February 1983, during a mental competency hearing, Rumbaugh was shot in the chest. While screaming, "Shoot me!" The date was set, September 11th, 1985. After nearly a decade behind bars, Charles Rumbaugh would become the youngest man executed by Texas since the death penalty returned. No family visits, no appeals, no pleas, just silence and a chilling calm. On the evening of his execution, Rumbaugh declined a last meal, requesting only a glass of water and a plain flour tortilla, perhaps a final gesture of surrender or of indifference. At 12:22 a.m., lethal injection flowed through his veins. His last words were eerie in their calm. "DJ Larry, doctor. Wheat, goodbye. And for all the rest of you, although you don't forgive me for my transgressions, I forgive yours against me. I am ready to begin my journey." Charles Rumbaugh died not just as a condemned man, but as a symbol of justice carried out on youth. He declined a last meal. His final words, "Goodbye. Although you don't forgive me for my transgressions, I forgive yours." Rumbaugh's execution sparked outrage and reflection. Legal scholars, human rights activists, and even correctional officers questioned whether executing someone so young, so clearly mentally ill, was justice or cruelty. His death became a rallying point in the push to abolish juvenile capital punishment, a movement that would gain traction over the next 2 decades. Those who witnessed Charles Rumbaugh's execution reported a quiet, somber room. No defiance, no breakdowns. Just a young man, calm and still, facing the ultimate punishment. A man who'd seen more cages than classrooms, more violence than care. His story wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a societal failure seen through the eyes of a teenager condemned too soon. Charles Rumbaugh's execution remains a symbol of the thin line between justice and vengeance. A teenager born into chaos, tried as a man, and killed by the state. His story forces us to confront a painful truth. When we execute the broken, we inherit the burden of what broke them. His journey ended at 28, but the questions he left behind still echo in America's death chambers. In the late 1970s, the city of Amarillo, Texas, was shaken by a series of brutal crimes committed by a teenager, J. Kelly Pinkerton. His actions not only led to the tragic deaths of 2 women, but also ignited debates about the justice system's handling of juvenile offenders. On October 26, 1979, 30-year-old Sarah Dawn Lawrence was alone in her Amarillo home when Pinkerton broke in. He attacked her with a butcher knife, stabbing her over 30 times and inflicting fatal injuries. Evidence, including bloody palm prints, linked Pinkerton to the scene. Less than 6 months later, on April 9, 1980, Pinkerton struck again, murdering 25-year-old Sherry Welch in the furniture store where she worked. Both crimes were marked by extreme violence and mutilation. Following his conviction, Pinkerton was sentenced to death. During his time on death row, he pursued multiple appeals, challenging the validity of his confession and the fairness of his trial. Despite these efforts, higher courts upheld his sentence. His case drew attention from human rights organizations, highlighting concerns about executing individuals for crimes committed as juveniles. As the execution date approached, Pinkerton's family made desperate attempts for clemency. His mother personally delivered appeals to federal judges seeking to halt the execution. However, these efforts were unsuccessful, and the state proceeded with its plans. As the execution date approached, Pinkerton's family made desperate attempts for clemency. His mother personally delivered appeals to federal judges seeking to halt the execution. However, these efforts were unsuccessful, and the state proceeded with its plans. He turned to his father, saying he was at peace and ready, before reciting a brief prayer and closing his eyes. Pinkerton's execution reignited debates about capital punishment, especially concerning offenders who committed crimes as juveniles. Advocacy groups cited his case in discussions about the morality and legality of executing young offenders, contributing to ongoing discourse on juvenile justice reform. Witnesses described the execution as solemn. Pinkerton's father was present, and their final exchange was emotional, highlighting the profound personal impact of the event. The tragic case of J. Kelly Pinkerton serves as a stark reminder of the complexities surrounding juvenile crime and capital punishment. It challenges society to reflect on justice, rehabilitation, and the ethical implications of sentencing young offenders to death. Halloween night, 1981. A quiet Texas town is shaken by the brutal murder of a nun, Sister Tadea Benz. Within days, 17-year-old Johnny Frank Garrett is arrested. But what followed wasn't just a trial. It was a haunting saga of questionable evidence, ignored trauma, and a controversial execution. Decades later, the question still lingers. Did Texas execute an innocent, mentally impaired teenager?
Today we're diving into a case that shook Texas to its core and continues to stir debate years later. This is the story of Johnny Frank Garrett. In 1981, Amarillo, Texas was rocked by the brutal rape and murder of Sister Tadia Benz.
Police end up arresting 17-year-old Johnny Frank Garrett. He also lived right in front of the convent. This is the story of Johnny Garrett and a nun named Sister Tadia Benz, who was tragically murdered on Halloween in 1981. A broken window, a brutal crime scene, and a frightened town demanding answers. Police arrested Garrett based on fingerprints and the word of a psychic. But Johnny had an IQ under 70, a history of unimaginable abuse, and signs of severe mental illness. No DNA linked him to the rape. Yet, after a questionable confession allegedly coerced during an unrecorded interrogation, he was charged and sentenced to death. The trial excluded key evidence about his mental state and abusive childhood, painting a dangerously incomplete picture. As Garrett sat on death row, advocates fought to stop the execution. Psychiatrists warned he suffered from dissociative identity disorder. Pope John Paul II even pleaded for clemency, arguing that executing a mentally ill youth violated basic human dignity. Still, the courts dismissed the psychological evidence and the state remained unmoved.
Pope John II actually asked for clemency for Johnny. So he had asked for this kid. He was like, no, like, please, clemency, some mercy on this kid. And so Johnny Garrett was awarded a 30-day reprieve.
Despite international pressure and growing concern about the fairness of the trial, Garrett's final appeal was denied. February 11, 1992, approached quickly, bringing with it a grim certainty. Supporters stood outside the prison, praying. Inside, Garrett prepared for the end. Garrett's last meal was a simple scoop of ice cream. As he lay strapped to the gurney, his final words cut through the silence. "I am innocent. The rest of the world can kiss my ass." His words weren't just defiant. They were a cry from a man who felt abandoned by a system that never listened. Officials claimed justice was served, but many, including clergy and mental health experts, weren't so sure.
I would like to thank my friends and my family. And I would like to thank my guru and everyone else who has helped me get through all this. For the rest of the world, well, you can kiss my ever-loving ass.
Then came the curse. In a letter left behind, Garrett condemned those involved in his death. In the years that followed, over a dozen individuals, jurors, lawyers, officials, died from bizarre accidents, suicides, and aggressive cancers. Whether you believe in curses or not, the timing was unsettling. But the real consequence? A national reckoning over executing juveniles and the mentally ill. Journalists and spiritual advisors witnessed Johnny's final moments. For some, it was another day in the system. For others, it was a turning point. One official admitted, "We may have made a terrible mistake." The horror wasn't just in the execution, it was in the deafening silence that followed. A life extinguished without clarity, without peace.
His last words, "I am innocent." The case remains controversial.
Johnny Frank Garrett's story is a haunting reminder of what happens when the justice system trades caution for closure. Whether you believe in his guilt or innocence, one truth is undeniable. A 17-year-old boy with a shattered mind and soul was executed in the name of justice. But justice, real justice, requires more than a guilty verdict. It demands truth. It demands mercy. And it demands that we listen before it's too late. What happens when the justice system executes a teenager, only to learn years later he may never have been at the crime scene? Ruben Cantu was just 17 years old when he was sent to death row, his conviction resting almost entirely on the testimony of a single, pressured eyewitness. The case would later unravel into one of the most haunting examples of wrongful execution in U.S. history. Executed in 1993, Cantu maintained his innocence to the very end. His case would ignite a national debate about the fallibility of the death penalty and the irreversible price of a broken system. Ruben Cantu was merely 17 years old when he was wrongly accused, convicted of capital murder. In 1991, a 17-year-old boy named Ruben Cantu was sentenced to death for a crime he always denied committing. From drug dealers to burglars, many children in the San Antonio barrio grew up in rough terrains. Ruben Cantu was one of them. It began as a late-night burglary and ended in a tragedy that would ripple through the justice system for decades. With no physical evidence, no confession, and only the word of one wounded survivor, Ruben Cantu was tried as an adult and sentenced to death. Years later, both the eyewitness and his supposed accomplice would recant their statements. On November 8, 1984, a robbery at a San Antonio construction site turned deadly. One worker was killed. The other, Juan Moreno, survived multiple gunshots. Under pressure and fearing deportation, Moreno eventually pointed to Cantu. But after Ruben's death, Moreno admitted he wasn't there. His friend and alleged accomplice, David Garza, confirmed this. Yet, by then, it was too late. On death row, Ruben was not just fighting for his life, he was fighting for the truth. He wrote letters to the public, insisting he had been framed. Legal advocates tried to reopen the case, but Texas's machinery of death didn't stop. While awaiting execution, Cantu's story drew support from activists and lawyers alike. His insistence on innocence never wavered. Appeals were filed. Questions about the trial mounted. But every attempt to revisit the evidence was denied. As the hour neared, Cantu faced the state's final judgment, not with fear, but with a quiet defiance. Texas prepared to take the life of a young man whose guilt was already being questioned, and the clock ran out before truth could catch up. It was August 24th, 1993. Ruben Cantu, 26, spent his final hours in silence. He requested bubble gum, denied. His final words were brief but chilling in their power. "No, sir." And then the injection. No ceremony, no spotlight, just a final whisper from a man still claiming innocence. If a mistake was made, it would now be irreversible. With no physical evidence ever linking him to the crime and key witnesses later recanting, Cantu's final moments became a symbol of the system's failure. His death was legal, but was it justice? At 12:22 a.m., Ruben died by lethal injection at the age of 26. When asked if he had a final statement, Ruben simply said, "No, sir." Ruben's death didn't end the story. It ignited it. A growing movement questioned how many others like him had fallen through the cracks. Years after Ruben's death, the Houston Chronicle and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund launched investigations. Public outcry surged. Former prosecutor Sam Millsap, who had once confidently sought Ruben's execution, publicly admitted it had been a mistake.
When I saw it, because I couldn't believe that even at the age of 35, whatever I was, that I would have made that decision. And so I called them.
The man who sent Cantu to death row faced the truth years later. Could a system built on human judgment ever be trusted to decide who lives and who dies? Sam Millsap, former Bexar County DA, had secured Cantu's death. But 2 decades later, he reviewed the case and was shocked. No physical evidence, one pressured eyewitness, and a growing belief that an innocent boy had been executed on his watch.
Okay, I was young enough at that point to not understand that eyewitness testimony is not always reliable. I believe
Cantu's case is no longer just a story of one wrongful execution. It's a reminder that even a single failure in a system of life and death is too many. The courts are human, the witnesses are fallible, and the punishment permanent. If justice is to mean anything, it must start by listening when the condemned cry out, "I am innocent